Eliza and I recently took the ultimate Southern California food road trip, visiting restaurants, breweries, ice cream shops, and farms from San Diego to the San Gabriel Valley in Los Angeles County. You can find these very fun episodes in the This Is Taste feed. And we can't think of a better time to support these restaurants. Thanks to our friends at Visit California for supporting this epic journey. Visit www.visitcalifornia.com to plan the perfect getaway to California, the ultimate playground.
So what I learned was all of the fundamentals about the wine world, terroir, regions, why it grows there, and its relationship to food. Remember, in those days, it was still pretty primitive, the relationship between food and wine. When I opened in Santa Monica in 1979, there were no wine salesmen. There were liquor salesmen who were being tasked with selling wine.
This is Taste. I'm your host, Matt Rodbard. Michael McCarty is the owner of two restaurants, Michael's in Santa Monica, which opened in 1979, and Michael's on West 55th Street in Midtown Manhattan, which followed a decade later. McCarty is truly the father of California cuisine, at the center of a culinary movement that produced top Los Angeles chefs like Jonathan Waxman, Mark Peel, Nancy Silverton, and many others. I had so much fun having Michael back into the studio, and he was happy to go over his deep history in the American restaurant scene. We also talked about his early days cooking in Paris and how he ended up in Santa Monica and helped establish the legendary farmers market there. It's Michael McCarty, the early years. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Michael McCarty, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming into the studio.
Thank you.
Well, I want to first ask, you definitively split time between New York and LA, running operating restaurants in both coasts. I just want to know, where are you dining out in New York and LA right now? I know you make time to see other restaurants and be in the industry.
Yes. Well, it's been quite a time. The explosion of restaurants is just huge, both in New York and LA. I mean, LA used to be, there were 6 or 8 restaurants there. And now there's 20 in every neighborhood, of which there's probably 300 neighborhoods. Yeah. It's exploded, the food revolution, And there's a great little restaurant near our daughter's house called Laredo. Mm-hmm. It's down in Frogtown, it's called.
Yeah.
And really good food there. We had a great meal at Damien.
Oh, yeah.
And probably one of the better meals I've had recently. Again, we never go to the East Side except for on the weekend to see our granddaughter and our daughter. But we had a great meal at Found Oyster.
Oh, yeah.
A beautiful Sunday lunch. And everything was spectacular there. Really what I really like seeing in those kinds of restaurants is there's so many different ingredients and the way they present them and the way that they put them together. It used to be in the old days, after we started this revolution of sort of regional American food, often like with any revolution, it goes too far. And that's what happened in those days. Just like with Nouvelle Cuisine. I mean, it went too far.
Yeah.
And then
you saw a lot of Kiwis on menus.
Yes. You had to dial it back. But if it didn't do that, you wouldn't have what we have today. And now it's just exploded with all the different ethnic foods.
Yeah.
It's through the roof.
It's amazing. Found Oyster. Now, that restaurant, the style of service I've heard I've never been. And
yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what you look for when you walk in on the service side of it.
Well, you see, the restaurants that I mentioned, in particular Found Oyster, are sort of the new way of doing business. There is in no way any formality. There's a professionalism, but it is still part of that sort of millennial thought pattern, you know what I mean? Where you go in and they have it down and you order and it comes and, it's not really about, even though the service is good, that's not really the whole thing. It's really the focus on the food.
Yeah.
Which I find to be interesting. Now, when you go to a Laredo or a Damien, it's a little bit more restaurant oriented. But I think that's also part of the trend. You've got you're not walking into Michael's or any of the restaurants, the Benoit, for old school. I don't mean to use the word old school, but I mean it was
Old
just
school
the style. Yes,
Yeah.
and that's why we've been in LA for 45 years and here for 35 years, because of our level of hospitality, which is going out the door. But in a lot of places, it's coming back.
Yeah, well, let's segue to New York,
Yeah.
which I think, in terms of fine dining,
Yes.
clearly the leader in America. That's hands down right
through
now.
the roof.
We have the equity, we have the money to support it,
Yes.
and really the chefs are flocking here. Where do you like? And we don't have to go fine dining. It was just an observation.
Yeah.
In New York, what's exciting?
Well, we had a wonderful meal the other night at the other night at 425.
Yeah,
and my friends and former great clients, until they opened their own restaurant, they owned the building.
Oh, okay.
You see, and so they put the building up, and they got Jean-Georges to go in there, and that's what you're seeing in New York. You're seeing that a lot of the big fancy buildings, Daniel Boulud.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it just keeps going.
Daniel Hum.
Yeah. They go, the developers are building these buildings, or the hotels are building these buildings, and they're financing what was something that no way could a chef in the old days afford a $20 million restaurant. That started with the Per Se, and then furthermore down at the Hudson Yards, where the developers were really into food. And so they would seek out these chefs and put them in there as an amenity almost.
Yeah. And I mean, Hudson Yards has struggled.
Yeah.
A little bit. They got the great wave. I mean, Keller opened his place that was short-lived.
Yeah.
So I think this is a great observation. I totally agree. But it's kind of challenging sometimes when you have building people trying to do food and bev.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at Miami, I mean, it's even more insane down there what's going on. Again, the revolution has succeeded and has been televised. And if you're good, there are clients that will, come to you and support you. And that's what we've always noticed. You've got to really be on your game, though.
Well, I had you in before, and we talked a lot about your career, and I'm going to link to that great episode in the show notes. Please go back and listen to that.
Yeah.
But there's so much more to cover. And what we didn't really cover in that first episode was your early life, because I feel, Michael, there's a lot of your childhood and your early, adolescence into your time in France that clearly informed you as a person, as somebody who obviously food is at the center of your life. So growing up in Westchester, what's food like at the McCarty household?
Well, the McCarty household, my mother, Carol McCarty, and my father, John McCarty, JT, as he was known.
Oh, yeah.
We lived in a little town called Briarcliff Manor. Beautiful, bucolic, stunning place to grow up. All 4 seasons were like perfect. And my dad commuted to Manhattan to GE. And that was in the 50s and the 60s.
Real Mad Men stuff.
There. Completely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he was in charge of corporate public relations.
Oh.
And that's a very interesting story. He graduated from University of Michigan and met my mother there, and he was hired immediately by General Electric to help them create corporate public relations. Because you see, before World War II, all the companies, most of them, were privately owned, and you would go see, there'd be Henry Ford at the restaurant or at the country club, whatever. And after World War II, the idea was they were expanding throughout the United States. And so they had to figure out how to do corporate public relations. How do you go to a community where none of the people that run it or own it live and ingratiate yourself? And so my father was selected, and he was given a partner to do this named Kurt Vonnegut.
Okay.
So the two of them sat in Schenectady and figured this out. And then in 1950, I believe it was 50, Kurt went on to be a full-time writer in Barnstable, Mass.
Yeah,
and
you've heard of his work.
Yes, you've heard of his work. And my father moved to Briarcliff, and that was the beginning of our whole thing. So there were no restaurants there.
Yeah.
So my parents and their friends thoroughly enjoyed entertaining each other. They had great parties. And it was very seasonal, again, without the sort of intelligence that's going on about this business today. it was really about, it wasn't like a subject of discussion. It just occurred. So springtime, summer, we had a little beach shack in Rhode Island, and, everything that we did, you'd go there, and my mother always had like the best fisherman and whose wife had the best garden. And so, in the 50s and the early 60s, you'd have arugula, you'd have beautiful swordfish, stunning lobsters, fabulous oysters. We had clams right outside in a little pond right behind us.
Oh, wow.
You go out there, okay, kids, go get me the clams.
Go clamming, roll up the sleeves.
Get in there. And, and you'd go out there, and this is the kind of time it was. There were 3 or 4 different kinds of clams out there, from steamers to quahogs to little necks, and all right there. So it was a very interesting time. In fact, I didn't even know what a restaurant was in those days.
Yeah, it was the typical 50s household.
Yeah,
your mother is cooking, and it's probably and this will lead to the 80s when you start going to Santa Monica.
Yeah,
she's using markets, I would imagine, not just the supermarket.
Oh yeah, well, in the case of in the wintertime, we had another little ski place up in Manchester. We skied at a restaurant. At a ski resort called Bromley. We were those gnarly little 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds that always skip
bombing
the line.
down,
bombing down.
Yeah.
But again, in each town, they would seek out the butcher, the fish, the produce people, and they were in those towns. And Briarcliff, had that kind of facilities there, which was really fabulous. And so I really got this sort of sense of that hospitality and the focus on all the different parts of throwing a great party from them and their friends.
And your father would, I'm sure, invite some of his clients and folks at GE up to the house.
Oh yeah, and
have dinner parties.
Yeah, and the neighbors were totally into this.
Yeah,
and like in Rhode Island, there were 22 houses, little shacks, all up on stilts.
Yeah,
and literally they invented things like the 3-day bash at Labor Day.
Yeah,
and because the guy next door was from Kansas City. And he would bring in every Memorial Day, he'd show up with a huge semi and he'd plug it in. And by the end of 3 months later, whatever was left in there got consumed during that. So you'd do the swordfish one night, you'd do the lobsters, you'd do the steaks.
A refrigerator semi.
A semi,
That's so amazing.
Well, he owned the Kansas City Meatpacking Company in Liberal Kansas, and I learned a lot from him, even at such an early age, because you would go in there and you go, my God,
look at the scale of these meats.
And he taught me about aging, which I kept with me forever.
Yeah. So Michael, you're eating a lot at home. It's to use locavore as a term. You're eating a locavore diet. There has to be a moment. You're a short train ride from New York City.
Yeah.
When restaurants start to enter your world and you start to think about restaurants as more than just having food. I mean, tell me about the early experiences.
Well, the number one sort of epiphany was I was accepted to go to France for the junior and high school program.
Oh, wow.
Yes, it was school boys abroad in those days. Now it's SYA, school year abroad. And they were put together by Andover, Exeter, St. Paul, about another 10 schools. And they had a facility in Rennes, France, and in Barcelona. And you would go live the whole school year there. You'd get immersive into a family. And so the night before we got on the boat, my parents took me into the city and we ate at a restaurant called Laurent, which was on, I believe, 51st. And no, where was it? It's on right off of Park. I think the Forgione is in there.
Oh, okay.
I think now.
Yeah, okay.
But it was a classic Maxime's looking place before I even knew what Maxime's was.
Right. You were getting your education.
Yeah.
You're about to see what Maxime's
And so we're in this restaurant. Everybody, it was in September, so everybody's back from the summer. They're all tanned. They're all good looking. They're all dressed up. Everybody got dressed up. And they had this fabulous just environment. And it was packed. And we're all eating at white tablecloths and fancy silverware, just like my mother's house. You know what I mean? And at a certain moment, Laurent walks in the door. And you could feel the electricity in the room go through the roof. like somebody just hit the lights. And I said, boy, this is really an interesting feeling. It's great to see this. I understand most of this because we would help my parents put these parties on. And we had this great food that came out. And it was, it was one of those French restaurants. It was not snooty and weird, and because they knew my dad and all that routine. And then at the end of the meal, they brought a bill, a check.
First time you've seen it.
Yeah.
You're junior in high school. You
and
haven't
I
seen
go,
a bill.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. So you throw one of my parents' parties and you give everybody a check and they pay for it, and it's fabulous.
Were they using plastic at that point?
No.
It was cash, yeah. It had to be. It was 50s, yeah.
This would have been this was 1969, I believe.
Oh, later.
Yeah, 69. Yeah. September of 69. And I got on the boat the next day, and it was a student boat, 1,500 kids. 1,450 were junior in college, and the 50 of us were in high school.
Goodness.
And
your brain.
Yeah.
What is going
And the boat took 11 days to get to Europe. I don't mean it took 4, it took 11. And it was like an old-timer boat, but it was run by Italians. And I knew nothing about Italian lifestyle. I knew nothing about, as far as we knew, Italian food was pizza.
Yeah.
Or Northern Italian was white sauce, or Red Italian was, Southern. So I had 11 days of the way that this crew ran this place, and they ran 5 meal periods a day. Very casual. That was another thing that was really important. Even though it was a bunch of kids, it was really professional to see the way that they ran breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and a morning snack and an afternoon snack. So I knew about aperitivo hour before I even knew what aperitivo
was. You were spritzing as a junior.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I landed in France, and I was put in a family that was exactly like my parents' family. And it was one thing after another. Fabulous. Again, all downscale, nothing fancy, but everything was spectacular. And again, extremely seasonal. Rennes is a fabulous little province.
Yeah, I mean, so Michael, let me ask you, when you're in Rennes and you're studying, you're doing your academics.
Right.
But are you starting to think that food is a career for you? Are you thinking that maybe the academic life is not what you want? And what are some epiphanies you have with the cuisine in Rennes?
Well, see, that's it. The answer is yes. That's where I learned fundamentally about the school system that they have there that we didn't have here in America. Trade schools were sort of frowned upon here. You would go to shop, or you go to become a plumber or an electrician, et cetera. But there, the whole gastronomy program was extremely set. Every major city had a hotel and restaurant school. And I learned about that, and I said, yes, this is what I want to do. I was going to go to McGill because they would take a 16, 17-year-old.
Wow.
And you spoke French in Montreal. Or I was going to go to Paris. And I said, you know what? That's what I'm going to do. So I went home, got my high school diploma, and then made the career choice to go to Paris. And I enrolled in the hotel and restaurant school, and the Cordon Bleu, and the Académie du Vin with Steven Spurrier. And again, I learned about the restaurant lifestyle in France, in Rennes, which is something we didn't have, the cafe society, so to speak. And they always were going out. There was always a sidewalk cafe. There was always a galette place, a crepe place, cider. I learned all that stuff that was going on there. And we were surrounded on 3 sides by water. And they had a little beach house in Quiberon, right next door to a little town called Bellon, where the famous Bellon oysters come from. And then they have the Girardot, which is the other oyster area right there. Everything's within 30, 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And they love to travel. They were hilarious, this group.
That's amazing. And let's tap into Steven Spurrier and studying under somebody who is influential in French wine and translating French wine for an American audience, but also educating French people too.
Exactly. He was again. I say, when people say, "Well, how was that?" I said, "Well, his primary concern was to demystify, the sort of weird thing that went around with French wine." And remember, in those days, it was quite simple. You had 3 regions. You had Champagne, Bordeaux, and Burgundy. That was about it.
Yeah.
And there really weren't any Spanish wines to talk about or Italian wines to talk about. Or the other areas like the Jura and the Loire and the Côte d'Rhône, that all came later.
Yeah.
The first place you go is you figure out, okay, Bordeaux, Burgundy, and you got to love Champagne. So what I learned was all of the fundamentals about the wine world, terroir, regions, why it grows there, and its relationship to food. Remember, in those days, it was still pretty primitive, the relationship between food and wine. Very primitive.
You mean that wine service in New York at a restaurant would not have the list that we know today?
No. Are you kidding? When I opened in Santa Monica in 1979, there were no wine salesmen.
Yeah.
There were liquor salesmen who were being tasked with selling wine.
Yeah.
So you would get Bouchard, Père and Fils, white, Burgundy and red Burgundy. That was it. Unless that was sort of the beginning of the collecting insanity of wines in America too. But there, the kitchen was separate from the dining room.
Yeah.
Like today, they're all like everybody's together, and the relationship between food and wine is so superior and evolved to where how many different kinds of wine there are grown in the world, made in the world, and how many different kinds of food, and so it's a much more. It was so fundamentally primitive in those days.
It's amazing.
White wine with fish, red wine with meat. And so what do you do about poultry? Well, that's where you go to Burgundy, if you know what it is. So I learned a lot from them.
It's amazing. What about like claret? Because claret, when you read these beat novels and you're reading these books from the 70s and you're reading about high society, you hear claret. You read it. What is going on there at that time?
Well, again, the really fun, fancy places. What Escoffier did when he created his kitchen, for the Ritz, and Caesar Ritz and Escoffier, the two of them. If you ever read that book, it's fabulous.
It's Lucas Barr's book. Yeah, tremendous work.
Yeah, and it's just so quick and easy and educational. And that okay, fine, we're going to put bathrooms in the hotel rooms, not down at the hall, no matter how rich you are. And so, that's a really good, and it was only a scant, 60 years later, 70 years later, where the revolution really started to take foot. And as again, I said before, when I was there in Paris in the early 70s, I was fortunate to be the timing of the Nouvelle Cuisine revolution and Go and Mio. And so there was a change going over. So you had 70 or 80 years of Escoffier, who solidified life in the food world and in the restaurant and hotel world. And then you had these young upstarts coming in and going, wait a minute, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And so having that opportunity to know that things can change, they can evolve. One of the reasons people say to you, how have you been there? Why have you been successful for 45 years and 35 years? Because we're constantly evolving.
Oh my God. I mean, we talk about Trois Gras and Bocuse as being the center of that.
Oh yeah.
Back to claret though. What the hell is claret? I'm just asking because I've literally seen it mentioned so many times and part of my ignorance.
Yes. The British.
Yeah.
The British, they used to own Bordeaux, evidently.
Yeah.
And so they got really into. There's two things the British did. They really got the Bordeaux going, and they got port going.
Yeah.
Two places. And so claret was always their terminology, and it just and remember something in England, they always did their roast beef with a claret, and you go to Stimson's, which is hopefully reopening. I think it's reopening in the Savoy Hotel, but that's where you still can get. I think you're talking about when you go in there. I'm not sure who's taking it over. I think it's actually the guys from who used to be at the Wolseley, Jeremy, I think is taking it over. I hope.
Yeah.
And keep it exactly the same. But you would go there and you would have your roast beef and you'd have your claret and you'd be fine. And everything they had.
Yeah, so I mean, it's clearly the Anglophile writers in New York, and maybe some British authors. That thank you for educating me on that kind of idea of this wine having this like cultural cachet at that time.
Yes.
Back to Trois Gras, back to French Nouvelle.
Yeah.
You're in France. You're studying under Steve Spurrier, but you're also at this important time when this new movement is happening. I want to tap a little bit more into your travels around France and some of these meals that got you thinking about French Nouvelle.
Yeah. Well, the thing about Paris was the whole way that the restaurant industry worked in those days, especially kitchens, where they were stages. So there was like free labor. Because all the hotel or restaurant schools, you're required to go and do a stage each year, and that's all you did. And, you basically were slaves because you never got paid and you worked 12 hours a day. And it was, the old classic cliche about peeling potatoes for a year. Yeah. And so my chef at the Cordon Bleu suggested I go to see René Lasserre at a 3-star restaurant called Lasserre, which is still there, actually. He's not.
Yeah.
But, he made the introduction. I went over there. I worked one day in the kitchen, and I said, on the way out, I said, I'm not going to work here, but can you make me a reservation for tomorrow night? And what I realized was, and that's what changed it for me, I could get the cooking part, and it was so archaic in the kitchens anyway that I knew that it was a waste of time, effectively. But eating in a restaurant like Lasserre once or twice, I could get the take of the restaurant, the kind of menu that it was, why it was. I saw the service. I saw the whole package. And so what I did was, and I catered in France, so I had money. All the Americans were thrilled to have a kid who spoke French because I went to Rennes and could navigate them entertaining, because there were so many expats that lived in, not so many, there were a bunch of expats, and they were just thrilled that somebody like me would come in and do their party for them. They wouldn't have to fuss around with a French catering company.
And you were cool. You were like, it was like 70s. Your hair was pretty long.
It was very long.
It was long, and you're living the lifestyle. Yeah. And are you into music at that time?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you're into like the culture. And you're like a cool kid from New York City who can speak pitch perfect French and can translate this food for these people visiting France.
That's exactly right. And that was, and I went from one house to the other,
Amazing.
Just parties, very simple to do. And remember, Les Halles was open in those days.
Yeah.
I mean, it was still there. It was just beginning to be over. They were trying the transformation and removing the beautiful markets and the craziness there. And actually, the Pied de Cochon and the De La Reine Equipment Company are still there in the same locations. And everything else is like all this new modern stuff.
Yeah, it's all like, I mean, it's unrecognizable.
Yeah.
And I've seen those old photos of the market there, and such an influential part of Paris.
But getting the supplies, understanding, how the French culture worked. You got the produce department, of which you got 50. So it means you got to go check them all out. You got the boulangerie. You've got the poissonnier. You've got the pork guy, the chicken guy, you got the beef guy. And it was always just one thing after another. Plus, it's so exciting.
It's exciting. Are you making cash? Are you cash in hand? I mean, you've got acumen. You understand a rudimentary P&L. You're probably have a nice margin going on because you're charging a lot. Right?
Yeah. Well, that was part of the business side of it.
Yeah.
The one thing about the hotel and restaurant school that was fascinating that they don't necessarily do here, I'm sure they do now, is that you did a third of it was cooking, a third of it was front of the house, and a third of it was the business side.
Yeah.
And then after about a year or two, you would make a decision which you're going to major in, so to speak. Go on to become a chef, go on to become a front person, go on to become the business side. So I realized that was the package you had to have. I became a chef because I realized I had to. I mean, I wanted to, but I had to. There was no way to run a successful restaurant where the chef quits on a Saturday night with 200 people in the dining room, and without me being able to create an environment where that could be taken care of.
It also just gives you a real perspective for food costs.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
If you're just the guy in the front, I mean, the chef is running the food costs.
Yes.
Tables in the back.
One of the things I try to train all chefs that work for me is that, yes, you can use spreadsheets. Yes, you can do this and that, but you should be able to run a perfect food cost just by, as long as you're priced your food correctly, as long as you're not getting ripped off, and as long as you're not throwing anything out or being stolen from, you should be able to look in your walk-in and know exactly where you are. You see what I'm saying? And that's sort of, again, with today's accounting world, people get lost into that.
Yeah, I mean, and the costs just escalate and quickly, and then you're underwater.
And you're underwater.
One more France question. So you're running the catering company, but I've read that you had
just me.
Just you, yeah, you, and I'm sure maybe a little help, or was it just? But like, let me read it. So, last question about France. You're running this catering company solo. I've read that you had pop-ups.
Yes.
So tell illegal pop-ups at times. Florence
at the same time. Remember, I'm multitasking. I'm going to 3 schools at once. I'm doing the catering. I live on Ile Saint-Louis, which is this little village in those days. I mean,
that's the island in the middle of
the little island in Paris that is now completely overrun by art galleries and real estate offices. But in those days,
a lovely place.
It was a beautiful little village, and you would have all of the little, like I said at Leal, mini versions. You would have the produce, the cheese, the bread, the chicken, the pork, the fish, all right there within a 2-block area. And so my friend had a building, and he had an old restaurant, formerly a restaurant, in the downstairs on the ground level. Tiny, literally as big as this room. Sat 20 people max with a bar at the end. And so he said, why don't you just go in there? Totally illegal. There was no permits or anything. And we just popped it open. And I would have I pre-order everything from the guys and the girls on the street. And but the order was very simple. I do 30 or 40 people a night. So give me whatever you've got that's fresh today, whatever it is. Sometimes it was total surprise. And they just put it on my doorstep.
Yeah. And
then I'd get back, and I had 1 dishwasher, a plongeur, and 1 barman who took the orders. And by 7 o'clock when I got home out of school, et cetera, everything was there. We prepped it all up. We opened about 8:30 or 9. I also got into that habit of people eating late. And that's sort of where I began to sort of make the what is my new American food. I would take what I knew from the Escoffier. I'd see what I've been trying in all these restaurants that I've been going to as well, with the modern stuff. And the world was small in those days, so it was easy to get around.
Yeah.
You're not talking about, like I said before, where you got to try out too many 300 restaurants to go to. No, there were like 15 or 20. And beginning to formulate what it is that could be produced that was fabulous and simple and fit within what I was talking about. And that was the menu that I opened with when I opened in Santa Monica in 79.
So let me ask you about this, back to this restaurant. Just one more question. What's the name? Does it have a name?
It was called Xavier, named after the cat, who was the security.
The security.
Yeah. But then, and so that went, and then when I graduated, all 3 schools, spring of 74, I went with 2 of my other chef friends and another friend, and we went to treat ourselves in Lyon. And so we went to Paul Bocuse, we went to Trois Gros, we went to La Pyramide, and it was spectacular. And it was, again, to see all of that, not in a big city like Paris. You're talking about in the middle of a countryside where each one of these restaurants was in like a suburb or even outside of that. Yeah. And yet there they were, and it was spectacular. Bocuse was over the top. There were only 2 other tables eating the day we were there for lunch. One of them was a single man, and turns out he was the head of the Paris Opera. And the other table,
standing res, I'm sure.
Yeah. And the other guy had his guest, and he had a case of wine on the floor, and he kept putting the bottles up on the table, and they kept putting them back in there. They said, "Non, monsieur, c'est pas possible. On fait pas ça ici." And it turned out he was Robert Mondavi,
Okay.
and Margaret. This is 1974. And so Paul comes out, and he was extremely gregarious in those days. He says, "You all eat together."
Oh, wow.
So we all ate together, and course after course after course after course. It was spectacular, wine after wine. And then we went up to Trois Gros, and we stayed there, which was great because we'd already had a huge lunch.
Yeah.
And then we had a huge
This is the same day, Michael.
Same day.
It's the same. You're doing the double with Bocuse and
Yeah.
Trois Gros in
Yeah.
1974.
Yeah, and both the brothers were there. Both
Yeah.
of them were alive, and their lovely wives. And the next day, we went down to La Pyramide, and Madame Point was still alive. What I really learned at La Pyramide, which I think traveled with me, was when we ordered the food, the wine guy came over, and he looked like a big hulking guy. He had thick fingers, did not at all look like a sommelier kind of a guy.
Mhm.
And he'd been in that cellar for, I don't know, 30, 40 years, Louis. And so I said to Louis, "So Louis, we're having this food here. And so select us a very nice white Burgundy and a very nice red Burgundy." And he looked at me and he goes, No. Where you are here, you need a local white and a local red. And he selected a Condrieu. Never heard of it before. Fabulous wine, still on my lists, 50 years later. And a Côte Rôtie.
Oh, wow.
And I'm sitting there going, my God, because as I said before, learning everything at Stephen Spurrier's at the time, they were focusing on Burgundy,
three
Bordeaux,
regions,
and
yeah.
Champagne.
Yeah.
What is this going on down here?
Yeah. Down in Lyon, there's this DOC that maybe no one outside of that region really is appreciating.
And that I think was a turning point for me. And then Madame Point said, where are you going next? I said, we're going to Greece. And she said, well, no. Here's what you got to do. Go over the mountain into Switzerland and go see a friend of ours who's a very great colleague, Freddie Girardet.
Oh, my gosh.
And you got to go see him, even though he's Swiss.
Yeah. There's a little caveat there.
Yeah. But everybody loved him. And I continued to eat until he retired.
Oh, my gosh.
Every year. I would go to.
There's no larger fan to Freddie Girardet than David Chang.
Yes, exactly.
David Chang will not stop talking about Freddie Girardet, which I think is very cool.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Listen, I mean, that's great that Chang knew the restaurant,
Absolutely.
knew what happened. And it's still a good restaurant, right? But when Freddie ran it, it was its own uniqueness. And that's what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
Like Madame Point, when Fernand Point, that was their thing. Yeah. They ran the restaurant. Same with Bocuse, ran the restaurant, and Trois Gros and Freddie there. That's sort of like they're so unique, they're one of a kind of a things. You really can't duplicate them.
I want to fast forward to Santa Monica in 1981, and really I have a very specific question. You're opened Michael's a couple of years or previously, but in 1981 the Santa Monica Farmers Market opens, and to hear you talk about France and the way you went to Les Halles and all the markets, you clearly, when you see this market open near your restaurant, there must have been a rush of adrenaline to your body. Take me back to those first early visits to see the Santa Monica Farmers.
Well, getting to L.A. in 1975, Christmas of 75, when I came back from France, I went to Cornell for the summer program that they had.
Finishing school.
Yeah. Well, it's like an American school.
Yeah, of course. From
cutting meat to business and tax laws, the difference.
I mean, one of our greatest culinary schools in the country.
And at the time, all of the students during the summer program were basically graduates from European hotel and restaurant schools that wanted to work in America. And it was a great one. Each class was 1 week. But one of the most important classes was a guy named Vance Christensen. Huge guy, loved life, just amazing. And he was fascinated with California wine. And so I didn't even know California. I didn't know California wine. Of course not.
Had you been there?
No. All on the east side, the East Coast. And so I learned of the revolution that was happening that began in the 60s and was, mid 70s, was beginning to really expand itself with, again, 12, 15,
Producer.
mindset people who love France, but knew they could do it here. Because remember, that 90% of the wine industry in California, Northern California, was all run by Italians because they all made wine in their backyard anyway. And so that was, if you go down to Sebastiani, Bondavi, Parducci, I mean, just all the names at the beginning. Bondavi, it's...
Your friend back from the restaurant.
Yeah.
Running California at that
he
time.
he just couldn't believe it when I walked into his office in Napa in the beginning. He was hilarious. I went to grab him in 1980 to become a board member of the American Institute of Wine and Food, which was based in Santa Barbara, San Francisco. And it was sort of a pivotal moment of trying to get gastronomy out, which was a terrible name still, but get it out of home ec and put it into the arts divisions of colleges and schools. And it was an interesting time. But again, that's where I picked up the whole California thing.
In that short session in Cornell, you meet this gentleman who's telling you about Napa.
Yeah.
Napa is a place.
Yeah, the Sonoma wasn't even Sonoma yet.
And there's no Central Coast.
No.
Forget about that.
No.
It's Napa Valley.
Napa was just sort of like epicenter thing.
Yeah.
So when I got to L.A., my parents had moved to L.A. So
okay.
I said,
Makes sense now.
I said, how did I get to L.A.? My parents moved there. I got finished with France. I was teaching French cooking and French at the university in Boulder. That was sort of after I left Cornell, I went to see my brother in Boulder, got shanghaied into teaching French cooking and French, because my brother and I, he went to the program in France before me. We were in experimental studies program that the French department would say, Michael, Tombo, you guys speak French like you're French. And I have students that have gone through all of high school. They went to France for 3 months. They went through college, et cetera, and they can read and write almost better than the French, but they don't have the gift of being French in terms of the way you speak. And so that's when I ended up teaching French cooking and French, just take the students' minds off of learning the language, but putting it to something practical. And the Episcopalian Church gave me their kitchen, and we had 9 students, and I did it for 9 months, a year almost.
Wow.
And when it was over, my final exam, I went to California to see my parents, who had subsequently moved out there.
What were they doing out there?
My father had retired from GE, and in Briar Cliff, you had a little college called Briar Cliff Girls College. And right up the street from us, and the president was a good friend of my dad's. And again, they entertained all the time.
It's community.
So one day he says to my father, do you mind if I bring my friend? We have an association of sort of colleges of our size and ilk. And she says, sure. By the end of the night, my father had been shanghaied into going to Rockford, Illinois, to revitalize and reimagine and reinvent a small girls' college from the 1800s called Rockford College. And
I've been to Rockford. It's not Briarcliff. It's not LA.
No.
What a place to end up.
It was so weird. But he did this successfully, and then the lady who financed it was from California. And she said, all right, JT, we're done here. Do you want to move to LA? I got another project for you, which turned out to be putting together the Pepperdine in Malibu.
Wow.
Again, the old Pepperdine was from the 1800s in the old Victorian Village, which is now very chic, by the way, down near USC. A lot of cool restaurants are down in that area, Adams. And so that's how they got out to California.
So your father, he's a brand guy. He's a PR guy. So he's going to these small schools and kind of rebranding them.
Exactly. He's sort of doing
he's a branding agency.
He's doing what Elon Musk wants to do with the federal government. You go in and look at everything.
Yeah.
And you say, okay, what's the good? What's the bad? What's the ugly? What can we change? What should be changed? How does it fit within the new language?
Yeah.
You're taking something that's ancient and you want to create something new, very similar to what I did with food.
Yeah.
And so that's all going on. But when I got to LA, the first thing I did in 1975 was call up Lois Dwan, who was the food critic for the LA Times. And I said, Lois, Michael, this is my background. Can I come and see you? Yes. So I went and met with her. And, she was sort of the Craig Claiborne of the LA Times,
Yeah.
pioneering.
What an instinctual move.
Yes.
To go right to the critic.
Right to her.
To the critic, right to the most influential journalist in the city. What a move.
Lois, you got to tell me who knows the most about food and who knows the most about wine. And he said, Jean Bertrand at L'Hermitage.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the first of the sort of guys who took the good stuff from Nouvelle Cuisine and the good stuff from Escoffier and created his own style, much like Girardet in a funny way. And Dennis Overstreet, he owned the Wine Merchant, and he was just beginning to realize that there was a culture there of extremely successful lawyers and doctors that had disposable income, and Hollywood. And Hollywood.
L'Hermitage is like a legendary Hollywood place.
So the wine pairing that we developed was in the basement of the Wine Merchant in Beverly Hills. And that was sort of, I would take the core group of people that were his wine people that were learning about wine that had disposable income, and I would teach them how to pair wine. So you moved much more evolved and advanced than white wine with fish and red wine with meat. We've bone out ducks and this and that. But during that time, I also met with Jean Bertrand's purveyors and said, and with John. And John and I opened a duck farm. We created a duck farm in Lancaster.
Yes.
And it was, again, why did we do that? Because they didn't have great ducks. And we wanted to create foie gras. We wanted to get that's a whole nother story about how that duck farm worked. But it was through a guy named Dennis Weiss had Northern Produce. I said, okay, so let's talk about what we got for ingredients here. And that's how I began to see who was farming, where they were farming, what they were growing, and what the possibilities were. And so, remember, when I opened, I was bringing in, as I always said this, I made the biggest mistake I ever made was not inventing FedEx, because that's what I would do. By that, the Leal had closed in Paris, and my purveyors were all at Rungis. So I would call them on the phone, and I would say, okay, this is what I want fish-wise. This is what I want cheese-wise. This is what I want poultry-wise. And the beef was exceptional here. The only thing they didn't do was age it. And that was part of
went back to your friend from Rhode Island.
I said to Bernie, I want you to talk to my guy in Kansas City. Liberal, actually, they were in Liberal, Kansas. And begin to age your meat. I said, how long do you age your meat? He said, well, we really don't. It's whatever it takes to get the time it gets to get here and it hangs out, that's it. I said, no, we got to go 28 days. Oh, no, it's cost too much. Nobody will buy it. It'll be reduce the waste and all.
Yeah, they'll shrink.
It'll shrink. And I said, look, let's just do this. And actually, we started out at a week. Then we went to 2 weeks. Then we went to 3. And then at 4, we realized that's the perfect one. That was the moment.
The dry aging program in America is invented.
Here you go.
You're humble, Michael. It just absolutely stuns me when you talk about these broad terms of this and that, and it's like, this is dry aging program coming to America.
Yeah,
I mean, a program, like we use that in lexicon and jargon, but like you created a program.
Yeah, well, it was you needed people that were good like Bertie.
Yeah,
at Superior. And, you would drive down Pico Boulevard in Beverly Hills, drive down and you would look into the window of his shop, and there would be half cows hanging in the window, and enormous. And people were just, people were beginning to get into that stuff.
To understand it.
But at any rate, finding the produce, where the farming regions were, we're right north of us is Oxnard and Ventura, two of the Oxnard Plain being one of the 5 growing regions in the world. Imperial Valley, obviously, Guadalupe in Mexico, right across the border, and then you have the San Joaquin Valley, which was totally, insane with growing
lettuce. Where are we getting our lettuce?
Grapes and lettuce.
Yep.
Table grapes.
Yep.
So we began to import seeds. We'd get people growing. We'd do this and that. So when the farmers market concept came up, it was a great collaboration. The city was really ahead of its game and allowing to take over 3 blocks.
I mean, just to look at it spatially, it's like a jarring scene to take over a parking lot.
Oh, yeah.
Like that took some...
Well, it's the whole street of Arizona.
Yeah, right.
And
it's the street.
Arizona, the whole street's now 3 blocks long.
Right.
And second, 1 block this, 1 block.
That's right.
And that was sort of the whole thing. Now, getting all this produce grown and setting it up, again, bringing the products in from France, you had to have clients to pay for it. And I think the most important thing about getting the chefs, through the duck farm, we met a lot of the chefs. And we shipped them to Le Francais. We shipped them to Bec Fin. We shipped them here to to New York.
Bec Fin in Philly.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Georges Poirier.
Yeah. What a legendary place.
Fabulous. Anyway,
cool.
They were the only guys. Jean Bonchet in Wheeling outside of Chicago.
Yeah.
But so that was the beginning of creating a market.
Yeah.
An economic market is developing that. Now, the other thing that worked really well with the farmers was that you would go to them and you'd say, okay, what are you growing? I said, we'd like you to grow these haricot verts, for example. We'd like you to grow these strawberries, for example, all from the seeds and things like that. And we'd say, how much do you make an acre now? And then we'd quadruple it. Because what we did was the farmers were able, for the first time, all the produce would go downtown, and that was it. They'd pay you your little stipend.
They'd be trucked out to wherever state, the 50 state, or 40 states.
And then in downtown, you'd have the jobbers or you'd have the distributors, very much like the wine business. Somebody makes it, somebody grows it, somebody makes it, somebody distributes it. And so all of a sudden, the farmers were getting retail instead of really bad wholesale. So it made sense to them to do this. And again, that whole, I don't know how many farmers markets there are in California. I mean, in Southern California, but in LA, there's got to be 20 or 30.
For sure, absolutely.
That are through the roof. And, up north, Alice Waters was doing the same thing with Jeremiah Tower.
Yep.
They were, again, because they were in this California lifestyle where the environment was so spectacular and the growing seasons were so long, that it just began.
Were you in leadership at the Santa Monica Farmers Market when they launched? Were you like part of the crew that started
push?
Yeah, the push.
Yeah.
As a chef?
I was chairman of the Arts Foundation.
Okay.
Again, we always did not only food, wine, but art. And getting public art in Santa Monica was a big deal. For example, if you go to the Santa Monica Farmers Market today, you'll see 6 massive topiary bronze dinosaurs done by the famous Lalande couple in France. Their daughter lived there, and we would go often to their house, and they loved to cook. So it was always that. But again, we never could have happened without the city. Santa Monica was an interesting experiment in, let's call it socialism. It was very interesting. It was sort of a forgotten town. It's 80% tenants. It was a big town. I don't know how many, 100,000 people, whatever. It's really a city by itself. It has its own mayor and city council. And they put a freeway through it, which sort of split the town, just like in classical cliche, just divided the city. And people stopped going to it because you could drive through it. It's like that funny movie Cars, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Good reference.
They put the freeway through, and that was it. So they decided to, really rethink their whole lifestyle as a city. And it's booming today, by the way. They revitalized all of downtown.
Yeah.
That continued. The 3rd Street Promenade was built in the 50s and was a failure when I opened. Tumbleweeds.
Yeah.
Just empty. Nobody.
Yeah, you walk down that today, and it's one of the most packed pedestrian plazas in Southern California.
Yeah. But the market there on Wednesdays and on Saturdays is really set the tone.
Let's go back. Let's head into the kitchen at Michael's, and really, I'm going to end this chat because we really have so much more to cover about New York, but we're going to do that at another time.
Okay.
Because I feel like I want you back to come back and share. But, you're putting the farmers on your menu, and you're getting some side eye.
Yeah.
You're like, what does this guy think? What does he think he's doing?
Yeah.
Tell me about that, like, you forcing your customers to understand that there is a farmer behind your food. This is the revolution of you. This is the Michael. This is California cuisine. This is the link to the farm.
Yes, and that was a riot when we did it. I don't know. I just came up with it because, for example, California has, as I said before, the beautiful thing about California, Northern California, Southern California, everything in between, it's such a fabulous growing region, everywhere. So, for example, like instead of the frisé au lardon, which was on my menu from day one, it was the Watsonville salad.
Yeah, so great.
With lardons and organic egg. It was the green salad, San Fernando Valley greens, the beginning of a mesclun, getting somebody to grow mesclun.
And then your customers, your Hollywood clientele, they're like, San Fernando Valley grows things.
They have a farm out
there. They have
there.
a farm out in,
And so we did that with everything. Nantucket Bay scallops.
Yeah.
Channel Island spiny lobsters in season. When you went to California in the 70s like that, you ordered oysters in San Francisco, anywhere in a restaurant. They were always called Blue Points. Yeah. It didn't matter where you were, what the oyster was. It was, and today we have Blue Points. It was like this.
They're different sizes.
All different.
But they're all the same thing.
But Blue Point sold, you see.
Yeah.
So I had a guy, Bill Marinelli, in San Francisco that I met, who single-handedly revitalized the West Coast oyster markets. Because like here, the oysters grew everywhere, wild, etc. But there they had them too. And so he would go through, and now you have, it's like Maine. If you go to Maine, there's a restaurant called Roberts in Kittery.
Yeah.
And Roberts everything in Maine was fried in those days. You'd go there and there'd be oysters on the half shell. And then you'd look at the list, and they were from 16 different coves in Maine, Massachusetts, even one in New Hampshire, that little bit of New Hampshire there. And that was the pride of place, so to speak. It was showing that you were regional, showing that you were local, showing that you were supporting these farmers, these growers. It was the same thing with everything. Whether you were buying Sonoma County goat cheese, Laura Chanel in the beginning, you just didn't want to put goat cheese on it. You didn't want to just put Laura Chanel. You wanted to put Laura Chanel, Sonoma County goat cheese, because that created this context of not only was fabulous cheese, but it shows you that in Sonoma, there's a girl named Laura Chanel who is growing goats and making goat cheese.
And that's
what France was all about.
Exactly. And linking it back to your time and seeing names of farms and producers on menus.
Yeah.
In these early days, let's talk about your customers.
Yeah.
Are there any customers of note who you felt got you right away, understood that, you were doing something very different and we are going to give you money and go a lot. Go a lot. So then the last interview, that what makes a good customer, you go a lot.
Yes, you do. You become a regular.
People
say, how do you become a regular? I said, come a lot. All you have to do is show up and just continue to come, and then you get to know us and we get to know you.
Yeah.
But in those early days, it was fascinating because, as I said, there were probably 6 or 8 restaurants that people went to, and they were old guard places like Chasen's, Perino's, which was like, a continental Italian, and Scandia, which was this wild Scandinavian.
Wow. Never heard of that reference.
Oh my God. Scandia was.
What neighborhood was it in?
It was in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Right up on the Strip.
Wow.
What is now West Hollywood.
Okay.
There was Ma Maison. Patrick Terai's family owns the Tour d'Argent, and it was his uncle's. And he patiently waited to go back and run the Tour d'Argent. But his father, when he was much older, had another child who actually runs it today.
Wow.
And Patrick continued to run Ma Maison, where Wolfgang got started. And but there was sort of like a real interesting place of just a handful of restaurants. So when we opened, we were like this, whoa. Lois Dwan wrote this fabulous article. Mm-hmm. Ruth Reichel wrote this huge article in the in New West magazine that Coleman Andrews had
hired her. Yeah.
Joe Armstrong was the publisher out there, and he hired Coleman, who hired Ruth, who was living on a commune in Berkeley, to go down and see what the fuss was all about.
Yeah, he writes about it in his memoir
Yeah.
in a really colorful way about, sending this very inspired young writer down to Southern California to see what's going on.
Oh, yeah.
And there's the
And she lived with us for like 2 weeks and wrote the whole story, how it opened, how it went before we opened.
That's called like frontline reporting.
Oh,
like
yeah.
embedding with.
Yeah, she was embedded.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so the clients, again, the word of mouth got out, starting with the guys that were, my customers at, that we did the little food and wine pairings at the wine merchant. It was a small world, food wise, and people heard about it. This is before the internet. This is before social media. People heard about it. That's how my original chefs came to work for me. They all heard about it. They all came down to see what the festival was about. Back in 78, this all sort of started to gel. I made it very clear that I had to have a restaurant that had a big garden. And that was very difficult to find. It was just by chance that I found the 1147 3rd Street. And it worked out because I lived in Malibu. I decided I'm going to live here. I'm not driving into Beverly Hills, which is where the Restaurant Row was. And that's why that whole thing...
It became a destination in some way.
It was a destination.
And like we know in the history of modern American restaurants, the destination kills. I mean, look at Blue Hill. I mean, like it's part of the trip. You got to make that little trip.
You have to go there.
Yeah, yeah.
But all my clients in the beginning, Francis Ford Coppola, they were big eaters. Samuel Goldwyn, even the old guys, the old Chasen guys like Lou Wasserman, they would come and check it out. But the most important thing that occurred, again, timing, was that when I opened in 1979, young Hollywood was beginning to take root. When I say young Hollywood, and they didn't live in Beverly Hills. They lived in Brentwood, Pacific Palisades, and Santa Monica, because the old Hollywood all lived in Beverly Hills and Bel Air and Hobley Hills, et cetera. They wanted to be out, they wanted to separate themselves. So when Steven Spielberg comes in, when Tom Hanks comes in, everybody in that whole, David Geffen comes in, Barry Diller comes in, Jane Eisner, Michael Eisner come in. They're all in their early 30s. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So they're sitting here going, and they didn't really have kids then. They said, okay, this is our place.
Yeah.
And so, again, I was very fortunate. And yet we would have a lot of the old guard. Jennifer Jones, she had a house in Malibu, and every Friday she'd come for lunch. Yeah. And she'd have Aubrey Hepburn. She'd have Loretta Young, So it was this thing that sort of, again, word of mouth.
I mean, the new guard, the Hanks and the Spielbergs, I would say, given that this is their new hang, to see some of the legends come in.
Oh, yeah.
That's part of that like entertainment existence in LA.
Yes.
You kind of want to bump into people at restaurants.
You would
have that intro, or if Wasserman's there.
That's the party thing that goes back to that Laurent experience and to my family's house. We created a party. I would say it all the time. One of my biggest slogans is great food, great wine, great people, great party. And the idea was that it was throwing a party every night. It was like Broadway. You have a show every night. And when, you would have, lunch was always very minimal. But who ate lunch there almost 3 times a week? John Dunn and Joan Didion.
Yeah.
And, they'd work until like 1 o'clock. They'd come over. They'd have 2 martinis each, a couple of beers with lunch. Dominic Dunn and Lenny, they would come and they'd sit on the other side table, even though they were estranged.
Yeah.
It was again a development of all of that.
Did you read Griffin's book, Griffin Dunn's
It's
memoir?
great.
Isn't I mean you're
he would bring his father in. Dominic was there all the time during the trials.
Yeah, yeah.
And then when we opened here in 1989, 10 years later, I mean everybody who was from New York that came to LA for business would eat in the restaurant.
Back to the menu.
Yeah.
You've got this clientele. You clearly are inspiring a community of conviviality. But are these folks like looking at the menu and thinking about this goat farmer up, 100 miles away? I mean,
oh yeah.
I would say we're talking about the early influencers without the internet, but
Absolutely.
are they starting to realize that food is more than just food? It's culture.
Yes.
Like I'm collecting this farmer.
Right.
I'm collecting Michael. Michael's my place.
Yes.
And this is like the early moments of foodism. What do you want to say? I mean, are they really? I mean, you could also say on the flip side, like the cliche is that they're just there to eat salad and talk about work.
Yeah. No. They were into it. In fact,
That's cool.
one of the early decisions
That's
I
cool
made
to hear.
was to not be in the kitchen during the service hours because I was constantly having to go out and explain to people what arugula was, for example, or what Laura Chanel goat cheese was.
Yeah.
Or why you have a dayboat, what was a dayboat day scallop, a diver scallop served raw, right? Like a crudo with a French olive oil, pureed organic beets, fabulous beets, chives, watercress, and, to explain why you would eat that. And so that's when I started going, and basically I would special every single table. Go to the table, go down the menu, saying, this is what's this is what's that. Any questions, this and that.
Mm-hmm.
Then a waiter would be right behind me, take all the orders. I'd go on to the next one. And because it was a real thorough education time.
Yeah.
And everybody was into it. We created a service protocol where, for example, if you're a table of 6 or 8 or 4 or 2, all the food hit the table at once. So the first thing everybody did was look at everybody's plate. And yes, we had the big Villeroy Bosch white plates. I called them up when I knew them from France. They had the basket decor on them.
Yeah.
And I said, listen, I don't want the basket decor. That's what everybody was using.
Mm-hmm.
I want it just the plain plate.
Clean.
And oh my God,
Yeah.
that took, I had to go to Luxembourg to get them to do that. But it made sense. There you have it. And
this is a modern plating technique that you would see at Mamesan, you see at Spago, you see all the places that followed you.
Yes, yeah. And that was the canvas. My wife being a painter, I understood what raw canvases looked like.
Yeah.
Gesso painted, so I didn't gesso the plate, but it came that way, white, and you would put the color and the texture. As I say, I sort of created this concept of modern cooking that was green, crunchy, and acidic versus brown, mushy, and sweet. Because that's basically what was happening. We were moving away from...
Oh, yeah. It's French Nouvelle, but with California.
But California and again, expanded, none of the little one scallop on the plate program.
Yeah.
But it was, again, it was it was a big education process, and it worked really well, and they were really into it. And I happened to have a brilliant wine guy. They didn't even have sommeliers in those days. Phil Reich was just brilliant. He ran the liquor mart at Boulder when I was doing my classes. Yeah. I'd go to him and I'd say, okay, I have $25. I need 5 wines. We have 5 courses. He says, what are you cooking? And I would say this, that, and that. He'd go, okay, we'll take this one, that one, this one, that one. Stunning wine store. And he... After I opened, or before I opened, I went and found him, and he came and ran our wine program. And we had a computerized wine list.
Oh, wow.
One font, one size, on the paper with the holes on the side.
Yeah, dot matrix printers.
Yeah, dot matrix.
Yeah.
We had a computer that was 4 feet by 4 feet.
Do you have those old menus in files?
Yeah, I do.
Do you have the?
Yeah, I have the wine list and file, everything.
That's incredible.
At any rate, so creating the menu was, again, all the work that I'd learned in France at my little place, and what we cooked, and the classics my mother and my father and my friends cooked, and that was sort of the basis and the foundation. And then because I had this talented team of young chefs coming in, Ken Frank, Jonathan Waxman, Mark Peel, Billy Flug, who was from Boston, he's passed away, Jimmy Brinkley, who had worked at L'Hermitage in the pastry department. And I said to Jimmy, okay, Jimmy, all of these desserts, we're going to evolve into an American riff on them. So in other words, we're going to take out a lot of the sugar. We're going to take out the booze. We're going to beef them up. We're going to do this and that. It was that kind of collaboration. And all my guys worked lunch and dinner.
Oh, wow.
And there was really no hierarchy because we didn't know who was good at what.
It's the Chez Panisse model in some ways. Your version of that kind of flat.
Everybody just do what they do, and you rotate, and you get good at all. Developed a cross-training program that became our sort of signature, why people came to work at Michael's, because you learned everything.
You learned everything.
And you moved up through the ranks, and not spending 1 year peeling potatoes.
Back to that, you learned.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to call this part one, because we're going to end in 1985.
Okay.
and part two is we're going to pick it up in 1985. And we're going to talk about kind of your evolution through Santa Monica and then moving to New York.
Right.
I want to hear about Elaine Kaufman.
Oh, yeah.
I want to learn about your relationship with her. Michael, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining This Is Taste.
You're great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Ashok Selvam, welcome to This Is Taste. How are you?
I'm wonderful. How are you today?
It's great to get to connect with you. We will do a longer episode because I want to hear all about your career, but I want to hear mostly about this piece you wrote in Eater. I read it right away, and I was like, this is such an interesting plot twist for the Charlie Trotter saga, and you reported it really well. I'm linking to it in the show notes. First off, tell me a little bit about Charlie Trotter. Who was he, and what did he mean to Chicago and really the global dining scene?
Well, Charlie Trotter was 27 when he opened his restaurant in Lincoln Park, and he was really attempting to do something that Chicago has never seen. He wanted to establish kind of that French brigade system. Chicago in the Midwest was known as a steak and potatoes town, and that was for a lot of diners, and it still is, represents what fine dining, represents is steak and potatoes. Chicago has no shortage of that. And he had this idea of, I really like vegetables. I want to establish relationships with farmers. A lot of the things that we take for granted, no one was doing in not many people were doing in the 80s and 90s. And he established this restaurant where it was the prime destination to celebrate. If you were at Trotter's, you had something to talk about around the water cooler. You had, something that would, make your neighbors envious. And he just wanted to combine flavors that weren't really presented in this way. Like it's cliched now, but he introduced a lot of Asian techniques and flavors, Japanese, into a traditional kind of French setting, and it was blowing people away with he was a perfectionist, and he was kind of a jerk too at times. His quest for perfection rubbed a lot of people the wrong way.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch the documentary Love Charlie, which is on Netflix, it's definitely worth checking out. And I think it's so cool to point out that he spent so much time in Europe and realized that there could be a vision of or version of this restaurants that he staged in Europe in Chicago, and he kind of broke this barrier, and that film gets into like that progression and the jerk element of it. It seems from your reporting in this piece, of course, he had his moments, and there was definitely some very bad behavior and lawsuits, and that's been well established. But I think on the other hand, in fairness, you reported that you spoke with some former staffers, and there are folks who maybe don't agree with that narrative a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Dylan himself was saying that a lot of these headlines felt sensational to him, and he remembers the father he played ping pong with, the father he ran at Oz Park with and played with, who was really into charitable efforts, and he has spoken with some of his kitchen colleagues that worked with Charlie and asked them, "Hey, is this allegation? What was that like?" And they seem to say that it was fabricated. But when you are just pushing a standard that no one's ever seen, you sometimes, are so driven that you're not exactly a people person. And the comparison, because it was in the 90s, and when you're talking 90s in Chicago, you're always going to bring up Michael Jordan. And he was another person that loved perfection and wasn't the greatest teammate. and him and Trotter, they shared that DNA.
So speaking of Dylan, tell me about Dylan Trotter and his future plans with the space.
Well, Dylan Trotter is the only son of Charlie, the the acclaimed chef who opened Charlie Trotter's in back I believe it was 1987, and Dylan was a very kind of reluctant restaurant worker. His first job in the restaurant world was 14 for his father's offshoot, Trotter's to Go, which was like kind of a gourmet bodega with Trotter's name. And he kind of bounced around trying to find himself. He definitely hung out around the restaurant. He would often have to entertain guests. His father, he would rather go to the movies, but then he would be caught in his father's tractor beams and say, "Hey, this diner and he's a real loyal guest. Can you entertain him a little bit?" And he would don a sport coat and do that. But he was trying to find his way. He was actually the person that found his father unconscious, and he would later die of a stroke. So that obviously sticks with you, to put it mildly. And he's been kind of searching for his path. He's worked in L.A. He's worked in Hawaii. And this is from other folks that I talked to. He just never really felt super comfortable in the kitchen setting. And then all of a sudden, a couple years ago, he kind of gained control of the building where the restaurant was. It's a building that was put up in 1938. Last day of the restaurant was 2012. And so he's now the caretaker of that building. And he decided to move into the building. There's a restaurant is on one side and there's a residence on the other. And for the last couple months, he's been trying to plot out the future of the space. And he decided, like, I heard rumors back in, I guess it was late summer, that something was cooking at Trotter's. And I didn't want to be invasive. And, I started DMing him on Instagram. There's a park nearby, Oz Park, where they recently renovated and they carve family initials to who donated to the effort. And I was sitting down with my 3-year-old, and all of a sudden I see Dylan and Charlie and his mother's names on the fence. So I DM him, and we've been kind of keeping that channel open. But now it seems like the plans, something's going to happen in that space this year under the Dylan Trotter brand. He's not sure of the name, but Dylan is a very thoughtful and deliberate person. He's taken to a real hands-on approach to restoring the restaurant. He is in no rush to do so. He doesn't he cares a lot, so much about his legacy and his father's, but he's very protective. He doesn't want to kind of sell off the building as an asset. He really wants this to be his, to reflect his family's name.
So he's at the space now, and it sounds like he's moved into an apartment that's adjacent to it. This is all happening while Grant Achatz is celebrating Trotter through Next, his famous rotating pop-up restaurant that famously pays tribute to an era or a cuisine. And of course, Grant Achatz of Alinea fame worked at Charlie Trotter's briefly, is featured in the documentary, and had a pretty complicated relationship, or even no relationship, depending on who you speak with Charlie Trotter. And you report that they have actually had some tribute meals in the historical space.
Yeah, they just started that up in January. The agreement was finalized on New Year's Eve, and knowing that Dylan wanted to dip his feet back into the hospitality pool, it just made sense. For what better way to celebrate, as Jason Weingarten, the new Alinea Group CEO, a magical dining experience than actually eating Charlie Trotter's food in that space. It is rickety. It is, the lighting is a little dimmer than we would expect, but Grant has really prepared some of the dishes. There's this cold tomato soup that is just sensational. That really, he says, that has personal meaning to him. That he worked on. He cooked during his brief tenure at Trotters. So it is the pop up. They're calling it a next extended pop up. Will go through February, but it kind of primes the space, and it's giving Dylan Trotter the opportunity to work things out and to develop his vision for what he sees the restaurant could actually be.
Well, it's a smart move by Dylan to kind of, ease into reestablishing Charlie Trotter's as a full restaurant by having Grant Achatz, cook there and have this special pop up in the space. Have you been in the space personally? Have you seen what it's like? 'Cause, I mean, this has been dark since 2012. I mean, it's kind of remarkable that they never sold it. It was never remodeled. It kind of just sat there for 13 years.
Yeah, the stretch Armitage Avenue is the street that the restaurant is on. It kind of blends into kind of the posh boutiques along the stretch, and it just kind of, you would still see the famous Serif T Trotters logo. And I've been inside. It is rickety. I think I mentioned the lighting is a little dimmer, at least to 2025 standards, because there was no Instagram. People weren't snapping photos
Wow.
back then. He made a couple of the carpet was torn out. It's still they got new carpet that matches. It's still red. He imported these sconces from Italy on the second floor. He calls the first floor Charlie's room, and he wants to kind of bring back the nostalgia of dining in the 90s to the first floor dining room. And the second floor, he's calling it Dylan's room, and he's not sure what the final product will look like, but he wants it to be more a reflection of him as a 33-year-old.
Well, it's really a great story, and I know, Ashok, you're going to stick with it, and we'll check in with you again to see what happens in Chicago with the possible rebirth of Charlie Trotters. Would you speculate anything, or do you have any additional reporting about who might take over the space as a chef, a concept? Is there any tell from Dylan Trotter about the future plans of the space?
So even before he, contacted Grant, or Grant contacted him, and to get kind of the blessing to do the next pop up, Dylan had started interviewing chefs and did 5 tastings at the residence next door. And there's a lot of speculation of Giuseppe Tintori, who worked at Trotters and worked with Boca with GT Fish and Oyster. He says that he hasn't decided what he wants to do. He recently left Boca, but I genuinely believe Dylan isn't sure, and he wants to get it right. He did say that his dad was known for wine pairings. He's been sober for 6 years, and it really responds well to the non-alcoholic movement, and he wants to have great spirit-free drinks. So whatever it's going to be a bit more eclectic. It won't be a carbon copy. It won't be a cover song.
Going to be interesting to follow this story. What a historical name in space, and I'm really pulling for Dylan, whatever he decides on, and I hope to visit myself. Ashok, I have to ask you, you're on the Horn, and you covered the Chicago restaurant scene so well, have enjoyed your work for years. Is there anything exciting you in particular about the Chicago dining scene to close?
There are 2 great restaurants that I want to mention and plug. Carino in Uptown. It's a tasting menu that blends a lot of Latin American flavors. It presents these flavors in a way that we haven't really seen. And they have a late night, but they're calling it taco omakase. I went last night, and the masa is just it's wonderful. I highly recommend that. And then this is a restaurant that got into a rough start. It's called Feld. It's a 20 to 30 course tasting menu, and it's by this young chef who is 32. He's a little older than when Charlie Trotter started, but he has created something so boldly unique, and I'm really excited about fine dining's evolution in Chicago, and seeing Trotter come back. It is to the conversation. It is really indicative of the times in Chicago.
Well, it sounds like you said Feld got off to a rough start. Was there just some early negative press, and he's kind of righting the ship a bit?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you have an inexperienced chef, you got a lot of early reviews. You should see the Reddit thread on this. It was probably the just bonkers with folks criticizing the plating, and probably it's the reason a lot of food critics wait a little bit before publishing a review or go multiple times. But they were they were on. It was pretty ugly. It was pretty ugly early in, and they didn't get a lot of spots, but now they had some Michelin consideration. There's a James Beard's. They're on the long list for Beard. The Tribune ran a really positive review a couple weeks ago, so I think there's a lot of potential there.
Sounds like a little bit of a redemption narrative. Sounds like a little TV show that might be, based around chef life in Chicago. What do you think about that?
Oh, what I was gonna smack myself if I had to mention it.
I know.
But
I'm
the
sorry.
Bear, which is likely going into its final season, and I think locals have had their I was talking to a chef. Anytime someone asks about the Bear, they tell their diners, "We'll only talk about it if you buy drinks a shot for the whole staff." And people have had their fill, even though it did a lot of positive things. Let's just hope this season 4 rebounds and we get the storybook ending that Carmi and company deserve.
It sounds like this is backlash, full stop, which is part of all media narratives. I love it. I'm so happy that was your response to the show. We're pulling for it as well, hoping for a redemption. Ashok, thank you so much for joining This Is Taste.
You're welcome. Take care.
This Is Taste is hosted by Eliza Abarbanel and me, Matt Rodbard. The show is produced by Shalia Harris and Pat Stango and edited by Clayton Gumbert. Theme music by Steve Rydell. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for updates on all cool things that are happening.